thank you for the warm welcome here today. It's great to be here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Everett Ward, President Everett Ward, who has done such a wonderful job at this university, coming in a time of challenge and restoring this Lyceum series, among other things. Great idea. It's a great idea. As he said, this is a tradition that goes back in our country for a couple of centuries. And it's a way of bringing the entire community together to think and reflect and talk about important things that we face together. As a politician, I welcome this as a chance to address you in more than sound bites, which I don't take lightly so often today. What we say is fragmented, and it's very hard to have the kind of civil discussion and the kind of debate that actually moves us forward that Dr. Fournier described. So this is a great opportunity for me, and I am honored to be part of a distinguished list of speakers that are going to be part of this series. Dr. Everett Ward and I do go way back. This probably isn't the time to tell you all about that, but we're good friends. I've just been delighted as his career goes from strength to strength and culminates in this leadership of a university that we all know he loves so much and owes so much to himself. And this is about the best way I can imagine of giving back to a university that nurtured him. And so the work that's going on here at St. Augustine's is drawing on deep reservoirs of respect and devotion and loyalty, not just with your interim president, but with many, many people in this community. I was able to be part of the Legacy Tour last weekend, and it was very impressive to see some of the old-timers come back around, to see people in the community, some learning for the first time about some of the historical treasures that we have here. And so this Lyceum series is very much in that tradition, reminding us of the legacy here. We're also reminded of the legacy of historically black institutions around this country, the HBCUs. We have in the White House now a president who has highlighted this, who has made it a centerpiece of some of his initiatives. You probably know of the initiative that the Obama administration took in 2011 to step up HBCU participation in a full range of federal programs. This has also brought with it some financial support, much needed financial support. There was a $2.5 billion investment in the context of the recovery legislation early in President Obama's term. I'm told that about $155 million of that made its way to North Carolina institutions. The Obama administration has focused not just on HBCUs, but on higher education in general. And that's, in fact, been a hallmark of the administration. During the first 2 years, and I'll say something later about the Obama administration and the way you have to segment different periods in terms of what has gone on and what's been feasible. But in those first 2 years, when the president commanded a majority in both houses of Congress, major student aid reform was high on the agenda. The maximum amount for Pell Grants was increased. The student loan program was reformed, with the middlemen who were raking off a lot of the available resources being removed from the equation, more of that money going directly to students. And the repayment terms made more reasonable, especially for students who go into public service or who have lower paying jobs. It wasn't a perfect program. There was a bump in the road, which some of you may be aware of, with respect to the Parent Plus loans, where some attempts to tighten the eligibility standards really had an unintended effect on really thousands of families. We've just been in touch with President Ward and other HBCU leaders around the state about the adjustments that the Department of Education now has made in that program. So the Parent Plus loan program, I hope, is back on the way to being a major source for student support. This brings us to the larger topic I want to address today, an overview of the major issues confronting our country, and with special attention to those on the national agenda, on the agenda of the President and Congress, some of which have received attention and are being implemented, others of which, unfortunately, are languishing and still waiting to be addressed. That brings us to the topic of the state of our politics, because you can say all you want about the issues that need to be addressed, and the issues that in fact cry out to be addressed. Think of immigration reform. Think of how long that issue has festered, how much it cries out for a solution. But if your politics is dysfunctional, if the politics is gridlocked, then that makes it impossible, certainly difficult, if not impossible, to address these major issues seriously. So that's really what I want to talk about today. I'll do so as briefly as I possibly can, because I want to have time for your comments and questions. But that interaction of a policy agenda that is pretty urgent, in my opinion, especially in an economy that still is recovering from the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The interaction between our politics and those policy priorities. I said a minute ago that when you think of the Obama presidency, you have to think of that as a bifurcated period, a bifurcated administration, with the first 2 years contrasting pretty starkly with what has followed. The first 2 years were characterized by unified party control of government. In a parliamentary system, that's a given. It always happens. You don't have divided government. It's impossible. In our country, the usual state of affairs is for different parties to control different branches of government. That was not true in the first 2 Obama years. There was his party, the Democratic Party, controlled both houses of Congress, and that made possible an unusual period of legislative achievement. And I would say, as someone who was in the middle of this in the House of Representatives, that this was a period where our country needed that. We needed a unified, powerful approach to the economic downturn that was holding us back in serious ways. As I said, the most serious economic downturn since the Great Depression. It's hard to imagine coming into the presidency with a tougher set of issues than President Obama faced. So you know about the achievements of those years, and I'll just mention them, and we can go back to this if you want to. But the main piece was the Recovery Act, and the additional support for HBCUs was a part of that recovery effort, where what we call counter-cyclical economic policies, based on the theories of John Maynard Keynes and other economists, counter-cyclical economic policies, where in an economic downturn, the government actually pumps money into the economy so as to prime the pump, so as to get economic activity going again. And therefore, in the short term, government spends money despite the economic downturn, despite the deficits in federal accounts, in order to generate activity that will bring the economy back. That was the theory behind the Recovery Act, a hallmark achievement of the first Obama year. We, of course, passed the Affordable Care Act, which for the first time in this country will make health insurance, health protection available to all of our citizens, just as all the other major industrialized countries have achieved. We passed major financial sector reform legislation, the so-called Dodd-Frank legislation, designed to make sure that the financial excesses that took us into this great economic downturn, or that certainly had a lot to do with it, make sure that those are not repeated. And then the student aid measures that I've given in more detail. Those two were part of that first 2-year agenda. Then came the 2010 elections. The 2010 elections, as often occurs, were something of a reaction. In fact, a major reaction to the 2008 elections. And they brought to power in the House of Representatives the opposing party. And I would say not just the opposing party, but an opposing party that had taken a pretty strong right turn compared to the historical Republican Party. Here too, we can talk about this more if you like, but I think that's pretty clearly what the president was dealing with. An opposition that really had an ideological edge, a kind of libertarian philosophy underlying it, which really opposed a lot of what government might undertake, and undertook and opposed a number of things that in the past both parties had supported. At the top of that list was the kind of counter-cyclical economic theory that I mentioned. I was there on the Appropriations Committee as the new leadership took over after the 2010 elections. And I can tell you they were not interested in priming the pump or in doing the kinds of things that might stimulate economic activity. And instead, they adopted a U.S. version of what you might call austerity. We know of that in the European context, but austerity is simply budget cutting, government spending less. And of course, there are times when government needs to spend less. But as a holistic governmental philosophy, it doesn't get you out of an economic downturn. And in fact, it's a way sometimes of starving essential governmental investments, governmental functions, that really are essential to economic recovery and economic health. Anyway, the philosophy was very different. No interest in counter-cyclical economic measures. And what has happened since then is that many things that have formerly been bipartisan have become much more difficult to achieve. And I'll just tick these off, and again, we can come back to these if you want. But we, for years, have struggled now to pass a 5-year transportation reauthorization for this country. Build highways, transit systems. That is something that, because the Republican Party, with this libertarian kind of bent, has, I think, almost every member of the House of Representatives has signed a pledge never to raise any taxes any way, anyhow. Well, if that's your position, and if your highway trust fund is running out of money for all kinds of reasons, then you're going to have trouble paying for a highway program or paying for the kind of transit system that we desperately need here in the Triangle. So the transportation reauthorization has languished. It's been patched up year to year. That's something we used to shout through with big majorities in both parties. We passed a farm bill with great difficulty after a lot of delays. We're still not able to pass immigration reform, although the Senate did pass an immigration reform bill with bipartisan support. That was a major achievement. But in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House will not bring it to the floor for a vote. Even something like the Export-Import Bank, which our business community in the U.S. is virtually unanimous in supporting. That used to be a bipartisan slam dunk. Now that too is opposed by the right-wing Republicans, and therefore is being patched up, not really reauthorized for an enduring period. And let me just finally mention the budget. We have, of course, fiscal challenges in this country. And while we do need to enact those counter-cyclical policies and get the economy back and invest long-term in things like education and training and research and infrastructure, while we do need to do those things, we do need to have a long-term plan to achieve fiscal balance. You don't have to look too far in our history to find examples of this. Back in the 1990s, once on a bipartisan basis in 90, once with Democratic heavy lifting alone, 93, we passed comprehensive budget reform proposals, which gave everybody something to complain about. And for that reason, they were probably pretty good plans. They did raise taxes. They did cut entitlement spending, and they cut appropriated spending. And so, but they also did the job. You don't remember, but your parents do. We had 4 years of balanced budgets. We not only had balanced budgets, but we paid off $400 billion of the national debt. That is not ancient history, that was the 1990s. And that's what we need to get back to, in my opinion, but it's what under the present political impasse that divides us, we simply cannot seem to achieve. Just briefly, I'll just say all this has been compounded in North Carolina because of the turn taken on Jones Street, the turn taken by the General Assembly. This focus on deficit reduction, we've not touched the main drivers, the tax expenditures, the entitlement spending. Just come again and again to cutting, education, healthcare, transportation, housing, research. That's not really a way to balance the budget, because you're leaving the main drivers of the deficit unaddressed, but you're meantime doing a lot of damage to your economy, to your recovery. That's been compounded in North Carolina because that same philosophy has resulted in cuts to education, cuts to transportation and healthcare here at home. Okay, just to wrap up, what I've been hinting at and what I'll now be a little more explicit about is that political dysfunction, political gridlock has contributed to the failure to address these urgent policy issues. And that's something that I don't believe is going to be easy to reverse. It's something we need to be thinking about very, very hard and understanding better, I think, than we necessarily do at this moment. Our country is divided. It's not just Congress that's divided. There are divisions in this country that are pretty deep these days, differences in political philosophy, and these differences sometimes coincide with divisions in religion and in social outlook and in ethnic groups and so on. But these divisions, whatever their roots are quite deep, and so Congress is not just imposing all this bickering. Congress in some ways is reflecting political divisions that are very serious. A couple of political scientists, Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, have written a good book about this called "It's Even Worse Than You Think." And what they say, I think, from the political science perspective, they say what we've developed in this country is parliamentary-style parties. In other words, sharply divided, parliamentary-style parties, but without a parliamentary system. In fact, we have a system where divided party control comes about more often than unified party control. And so our system, by definition, bogs down gridlocks if the parties don't find some way to cooperate. And they're certainly not finding many ways to cooperate these days. So this has lots of consequences. Again, I won't mention too much now. We'll come back to it if you want, but I'm on the Appropriations Committee. Appropriations has traditionally been a bipartisan function, no matter who the president is. We get together and hold the president accountable. We write budgets each year, review them line by line. If your party divisions infect that process, make that process not work well, the institution is weakened. And that's exactly what's happened to the Congress. To say nothing of the bipartisan capacity that was evident back in the 90s when we got those big budget deals together. That seems like a distant dream. So what's the way back? I'll conclude with this, and if you expect an easy answer, I'm afraid I don't have one. I mean, that comment about parliamentary systems and parliamentary parties, I mean, that shows you it's pretty deep-seated. It's not something somebody's just going to, with a lot of goodwill, solve immediately. There are divisions, they're real divisions, and they're difficult to overcome. There are some bipartisan pockets that remain. Dr. Fournier referred to my work on the House Democracy Partnership. We, on foreign policy matters, working with developing countries, we do that in a bipartisan basis. A lot of our appropriations work is still bipartisan. I wouldn't want you to think that what you see on C-SPAN is totally representative of the Congress. There still is some difference that we can make as individual members. I can make, I think, where I'm working. It doesn't matter. Do I choose to cooperate? Do I choose to be confrontational? I think those decisions are made every day. And so there's some potential there. There's some interesting issue convergence going on in this country. I'm sure you've noticed some convergence between the progressive Democratic views and these libertarian Republican views on gay rights, for example. That issue is moving in the direction of being resolved in ways that we might not have thought of 10 years ago. Some of the excesses of the war on drugs, these mandatory minimum sentences, a lot of folks are figuring out, on the left and the right, that those weren't good ideas. They need to be reversed. So there is some convergence on some issues. And then finally, I just think we're going to have to start supporting and rewarding politicians who may take a more practical approach to politics. So that brings me to my final point. I want to urge you to pay attention to these things, to get involved this fall in the very important political campaign that's already well underway here in North Carolina. The General Assembly of this state has not necessarily made it easier for you to get involved. In fact, this time you can't just go to early voting and register. You have to register separately by October 10th. I'm sure you're going to have chances to do that. I hope you will do that. That loss of same-day registration was a huge blow, by the way, which will make it more challenging to participate in this state. There are going to be early voting opportunities. You're going to want to learn about those and participate, but that doesn't do you any good unless you register by October 10th. And then we all need to take more seriously the responsibilities of citizenship. I know every ward well enough to know that one of the purposes of reinstituting this Lyceum series is to encourage good citizenship, to encourage all of us to think about the major issues confronting us and to think about wherever we're located, what we can contribute to a solution. College years are extremely important in this regard. I'll just tell you, when I was sitting where you are, I was in the process of having my social and religious and political ideas pretty seriously transformed. This was as the civil rights movement swept across the South. It was when the sit-ins were in North Carolina were capturing national attention. I had the good fortune, really the good fortune, to be in college at a place where those currents were swirling very powerfully. And I was never the same. I mean, my political identity, my political course was largely set in those years. So don't ever underestimate the importance of what you're thinking about and debating and learning here, both inside and outside the classroom. So you probably expected me to say this, but I will say it as powerfully as I know how. We all need to take seriously the responsibility for citizenship. It's not just about us, not just about our group and our interests. It's about the common good and how we're all a part of something bigger than ourselves. That most certainly includes our country and our state at this